Hi, this is Metta Spencer, and this time we're off to Africa, where we're going to have a chat with Daniel Maxwell. He's a Henry Lear Professor in Food Security in the Friedman School of Nutritional Science at Tufts University, where they specialize in famine. That's his specialty, and he's off in Africa doing field work these days, so I was able to catch him in Nairobi. He is sitting in his office. Hello, Dan.
Right. Good afternoon or good morning, I guess, Toronto time.
Yeah, it's 7:10 a.m. here. You got me up early today. I mentioned to you whenever I approach a food expert and say, "Would you like to be on my show?" They say, "Well, no, I'm really an expert on food security, and I don't really know anything about famine," which always used to puzzle me because I thought famine, after all, is just the other end of a continuum of food abundance. So that puzzled me. But in fact, I understand that for a lot of reasons, we need to think of it more as an issue of human rights and of concern with war than with access to good agricultural methods and good market and so on. So, what's your story about famine? You've been studying it lately in, I think, South Sudan, haven't you?
Yeah, we've been looking at the issue of sort of the reemergence of famine, which really began in Somalia in 2011, and then by 2017 there were four countries that we were particularly worried about. You may remember talk about four famines in 2017, and maybe some other countries kind of on the risk watch list at the moment. To go back though to your sort of opening question about the difference between food security and famine, it's not like there's something qualitatively different about famine. It's just that it is the most extreme form of food insecurity. And it's often defined not only in terms of poor access to food, but also greatly elevated child malnutrition, for example, and in the worst cases, severely elevated mortality as well. I mean, there is kind of a technical definition that we use these days that involves all three of those indicators. So something like this, more than 20% of households in a given population that is at least 10,000 people having, for all practical purposes, no access to food, nothing from their own production, nothing that they can access by the market, and nothing that they can access through either their own social networks or some kind of social protection program, whether operated by the government or by a humanitarian agency. So effectively no access to food in at least 20% of the population. 30% of the kids wasted or suffering from what is technically called global acute malnutrition, which means that children are way too underweight for their height. And then accrued mortality rate or accrued death rate of at least 2 people per 10,000 population per day, which may not sound like a lot of people, but for comparison's sake, the crude death rate in a country like the United States might be 0.17 or 0.18 or something like that per 10,000 per day. And even in a sub-Saharan African country like Kenya, it's probably only about 0.2 something. So this would be eight times higher than a baseline kind of expected rate. So a fairly serious loss of life. That's the technical definition. But to back up to your question about food security can be all kinds of things. It can be about, is enough food available overall? Do we produce enough food to feed everybody? And that's what we used to worry about. If you recall back to the food crisis of the 1970s, it was all about global supply not being able to reach to fulfill global requirements, but the requirements were based on biological requirements. And if you recall, in the early to mid 70s, there was a couple of years when food production globally did not meet the requirements, the sort of 2,100 kilocalorie a day kind of requirements for.
Was that true in the 70s, in that bad one, famine in Somalia? Was that caused by drought or something? Do you know which one I'm talking about? I don't remember. It was in the 70s.
Well, there was a very serious famine in Somalia in the early 90s. There was a smaller one in the 70s. I don't think it made I don't think it made international news very much because it was limited to a pretty small population. But you know, you remember the sort of food crisis of the 1970s. That was all about production. In the 1980s, a very famous book was written by Amartya Sen that pointed out that famines occur not because of a shortage of food, but because certain groups in the population don't have access to adequate food. Mm-hmm. And his example was the famine in Bengal in India during World War II, in which there was plenty of food being produced, but certain groups of people in the population either had something destroyed about their livelihoods in the case of artisanal fishers, or there was quite high wartime inflation, and certain groups their wages weren't increasing as fast as the price of food. So landless laborers in particular, of which there were a lot in West Bengal, and artisanal fishers, both kind of lost the ability to buy enough food with the income that they could make from their livelihoods. And so it was much more a question of there was plenty of food available, but certain groups in the population simply couldn't get access to it. In this case, mostly economic access. Mm-hmm. So there's an element about overall food availability. There's an element about certain groups having adequate access, and then there's also the sort of human biological factor about even if you consume enough food, is your body healthy enough to be able to digest it and actually utilize it well? So there's elements of
are there cases of famine in which
not I don't well
properly and digest food or what? About that angle.
These things all kind of get tied up together. So it's not unusual in an actual famine or even a food security crisis of lesser severity to find if children are dying, they aren't actually outright starving to death, but because of inadequate access to food, kids get malnourished. Malnourished kids have compromised immune systems, and there's actually things like measles or malaria or diarrhea or cholera or something that actually causes kids to die. Mm-hmm. So if you look at proximate causes, even in a very serious famine, most of it is likely to be caused by killer diseases, not out and out starvation.
Oh, is that true of just children? Because I'd also heard that in a famine, most people actually don't die of starvation directly, but of some disease they catch.
Yeah, it's true of adults as well, but adults have a little bit more leeway than young kids do in terms of being able to survive. Mm-hmm.
Now you mentioned Amartya Sen's book. The thing I remember and that was discussed most about that at the time was his argument that democracies don't have famines. And so it was put onto that framework, although certainly I know he did refer to, I think he was there during the Bengal famine himself.
I think he was a young boy. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, actually, the democracies don't happen. That famines don't happen in democracies argument was actually a later book, and it was a bit more controversial. But what the point he was making was that certain institutions in a democracy help raise the alarm and then help hold authorities accountable for ensuring that famine doesn't. That a food security crisis doesn't deteriorate into a famine. So, institutions like free press or the right to the freedom of assembly, freedom of free speech, etc., are all important safeguards. And, if you look at places where famines have occurred, they've often occurred in countries that have repressive governments that do not have a free press, that do not have a good record as far as human rights violations are concerned, etc. On the other hand, I think people took that argument a little bit too far, and so like if you recall the crisis in Niger in the mid 2000s, people were saying, "Oh well, this disproves Amartya Sen because Niger had elections, and yet look, they've still got a famine." So it's not just a matter of do you have elections; it's a matter of do you have those kinds of institutions of democracy that both guarantee free elections and also help serve as a safeguard against famine.
Well, that's true. Also, you can have a whole conversation about what is a democracy, and sometimes illiberal. Anyway,
right,
that's a little off our beaten track. Also, I was thinking about the Irish famine, which I gather that potato famine was about blight, but I had also heard that a lot of it was caused by the fact that somehow the Brits had control of their food supply, and they were actually exporting food at the time. Is that true? And how did that work? What was the economic situation that made that possible?
Yeah, that's true, and it brings out an important point between the sort of, if you will, the trigger for the crisis, as compared to the sort of underlying circumstances or the circumstances that created vulnerability to a famine in the first place. So, I mean, in the case of Ireland, and I'm by no means an expert on that. The issue there was that yes, the sort of trigger for the crisis was the potato blight, but the underlying factors, the sort of background to the famine was that much of the land in Ireland was owned by absentee British landlords, and the wages that Irish peasants could earn working on what was conceivably their own land, although it had been expropriated, was barely at a kind of a subsistence level to begin with. And so the potatoes were the crop that they could grow themselves to kind of subsist on, but much of their labor went into export crops that they never saw any particular profit from. So when something came along that wiped out the one crop that they could rely on for subsistence, it took people over into famine pretty quickly. But there was still a lot of food being produced, and it was being exported all the way through the first couple of years of the famine. I think maybe by the third year of the famine, food was no longer being exported. But by that point, people were leaving in droves, and production was crashing dramatically. The takeaway point, though, being that there are things that can trigger a famine or a food security crisis of a lesser magnitude. Mm-hmm. And those aren't necessarily the same things as the sort of underlying causes. Mm-hmm. So in this case, the underlying causes had to do with land ownership, had to do with sort of wage labor that was barely at subsistence levels, even in normal or good times. And then something came along and destroyed the subsistence crop on which people relied, and that's what took people over into famine. But it isn't fair to say that the Irish famine was caused by blight. The blight was the trigger, but the underlying causes were much deeper than that. And that's often the case with other crises too.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, I guess that sort of brings my question to the question of global warming, because although I believe all or almost all of the famines that are going on or today or have in the last few years have been in the context of a war or some major conflict where mm-hmm. one side is trying to deprive the other of food as a weapon to force them to submit in some way. One of the questions connected with that is that likely to continue to be the main cause or the almost exclusive cause of famine in the next, throughout the next generation as we get more into global warming? Or is the effect of drought and floods and all of these other natural disasters resulting from global warming going to be a major factor causing food insecurity and even famine?
Okay, that's a complicated question. So a couple of things. First of all, again, going back to that technical definition of famine that I gave you, The cases that we have seen of famine since there was a sort of a consensus that was the definition we were going to run with, have all been in countries that have been experiencing conflict of some kind or another. So in particular, Somalia in 2011, when there was both a major drought, and I guess people argue over whether climate change was the cause of the drought or not, but certainly we've seen both increasing frequency and increasing intensity of droughts in this part of the world over the past 20 years. So I think most reasonable people assume that climate change has something to do with that. Whether it drives an individual drought or not, I guess is still somewhat questionable. But that was combined with a food price shock that had really nothing much to do with the local production shock that was caused by the drought. So there was a global food price crisis in the spring of 2011, you probably recall. It was also linked to like one of the triggers of the Arab Spring, etc. But a country like Somalia imports most of its basic food grains, even in a good year, and this was a bad year. And the price of food, price of basic grains more or less tripled in the first half of 2011. And there was a war going on between Al-Shabaab, which has been labeled as a terrorist group, and the sort of fledgling transitional federal government of Somalia and its Ethiopian allies and its African Union allies. So there was a war going on, there was a serious drought, and then there was this food price shock. That combination of things tipped it over into a famine. Mm-hmm. The other recent cases have been northeastern Nigeria, where there is also a major counterinsurgency war going on against Boko Haram. South Sudan, where there's a civil war going on, largely between the government and parties that have broken off from the government, although there's a few sort of freelance militias thrown in there now as well. And then
I want
finally,
you to elaborate on that in a bit, because I don't know much about what's going on in South Sudan, but let's
okay.
Come back
so anyway,
to that later.
Across all those cases, conflict is the common denominator, but certainly the situation in Somalia was triggered to a large degree by a drought, and the situation in Yemen, while it's not, that crisis isn't being caused by a drought, Yemen has long been the most water deficit country in the Middle East, and that's only getting worse. So that doesn't help matters any. It's certainly not the proximate cause of a famine, but it's a factor in the background. Mm-hmm. So that's one thing. That any modern day famine is likely to have multiple causes, but the common denominator across them all is conflict. But the second thing is, and this is something that we've tried to look into quite a bit in the Feinstein Center, is this sort of second degree impacts of climate change, if you will. In other words, the first degree impacts would be things like, okay, there's more drought or floods. Those obviously impact agricultural production. They may impact prices, etc. They may also impact disease vectors. As temperatures warm, there may be more, particularly vectors for malaria and other things that don't necessarily of themselves cause famines, but they may be the leading cause of mortality in a famine. Uh-huh. And then finally, there is a sort of a conflict knock-on effect from climate change. So, for example, and don't read too much into this example, but there is a kind of a climate change story behind the Darfur crisis in the mid 2000s, which was a nasty war, and it was a highly politicized war, and it wouldn't have led to the crisis that it did if it hadn't been politicized. But one of the background factors was that there are nomadic herds people who live in the north part of Darfur who took their livestock on kind of a transhumance pattern of grazing farther to the south in the summer. In the dry season, farther back to the north in the summer with the rains. And as climate change slowly took effect, they were having to go farther and farther south to find dry season grazing for their livestock. and they were staying in those places longer. And that brought them into conflict with farming groups or groups who were used to using that land for their own livestock. So there was some underlying
ethnic group. Was that part of it or not?
Yes, yes. But it wouldn't be fair to call it just an ethnic conflict. It was a conflict over resources. But the point is, when the insurgency in Darfur grew, there was a group of people, these nomadic herders from the north, that had a bit of a grievance anyway with people from the south, and they were very easily recruited into sort of pro-government militias, and they were the ones that did most of the dirty work in terms of burning villages, displacing people, the killing, the rape, etc. It wasn't so much the regular army that was doing it. It was these militias, and sort of in the background there was a climate change story. It was by no means the full story. The full story was that groups with a local grievance were dramatically politicized by the government to sort of what Alex de Waal would call counterinsurgency on the cheap. But they were the ones that the government mobilized to put down the insurgency. So to get back to my original point, there is a kind of conflict knock-on effect from climate change that we're seeing in a lot of places. So to say that climate change is one driver of conflict and of food insecurity or famine, and that conflict is a totally different driver is a little bit to silo things too much. There is an overlap between climate change and conflict, and that's not to say that all conflict is about climate change. Obviously, most conflict is political to some degree or another. But there is some overlap in the background there. So,
okay, this brings up a larger question. I know that some people have argued that, in fact, hunger is a major cause of war. And the little bit of research that I have read on that suggests that's not really often the case. And here's where, I shouldn't express my own point of view on this because I don't have one, but what I came to as a kind of an interim position a few years ago was that in general, when people are hungry, they are not exactly in a good condition to start a war, and that wars are not often caused by a shortage of food. But people are more likely to lie down under a tree and succumb than to go to war over food. Tell me, that's a crackpot theory, but tell me what you think.
Well, if people are literally starving, you're right. They probably aren't of a mood to go and start a war. But and I guess it also isn't necessarily to say that what hunger causes is a war in the sense of we think of war, but it certainly is a cause of political unrest, and the political unrest can spiral into something that you would call a war. Probably the best case of this in recent history is so-called Arab Spring. And I already mentioned that the Arab Spring was was happening at the same time as the situation was spiraling out of control in Somalia that led to the famine in 2011. So in the spring of 2011, the price of food grains globally tripled for a variety of reasons, some of which had to do with speculation, some of which had to do with production.
I'd heard that it
didn't stay high that long. But
I'm again drawing you off course, but I heard that it had something to do with the fact that during that period of time, there was a big drive to convert grain into fuel. That was
one of the causes too.
Yeah, was that part of it?
Yeah, there was that was at kind of the height of the methanol drive, and then there was some market speculation and various other things going on. But the point being, people were in the Arab world in particular heavily reliant on bread for their sort of staple food, and the price of wheat tripled. Now that didn't start a war per se, but it was one of the triggers. Mm-hmm. And again, this is the difference between a trigger and an underlying cause. The underlying causes of the Arab Spring were multiple. They had to do with poor economic opportunities. They had to do with education opportunities. They had to do with the lack of democracy and the lack of freedom of expression, all kinds of things. But one of the triggers was definitely the fact that the price of bread tripled in the spring of 2011. And so that didn't lead to a war per se, but it led to significant political unrest. And I guess you could say in the sort of longer term that that was one of the triggers of the war in Syria, the war in Libya, and maybe even you can trace a little bit of the war in Yemen back to that time frame. So hunger can lead to political unrest, and political unrest, if it spirals out of control, can lead to war.
Yeah, now back, just interrupting again, this thing about Syria, I'd also heard the following, that there was a drought and that farmers had to leave their land, and a lot of them went to cities, and that's where they got recruited into insurgent organizations. That's a short capsule version of a theory that I've heard. Does that hold water?
I don't know. I do know that there was a drought in Syria at that time, but the drought was not. It was the price of food, which was a global phenomenon. It wasn't localized in either Syria or Somalia. It was a global phenomenon, and I think that the price of bread had much more to do with putting people on the streets in protest against government policies and so forth. Than the drought did. Anyway, the point I was going to make was there was considerable concern about this in U.S. policymaking circles. So there was sometime later a workshop or seminar or something convened at Cornell University. And by the way, if you want to talk to somebody who knows a lot more about this than I do, you should talk to Chris Barrett at Cornell. He was the one that convened this workshop or meeting. I forget exactly what it was called, but it was about the relationship between political instability and food insecurity. And so they asked me to come and talk about Somalia, and I did. And my thesis was that political instability was one of the causes of the Somalia famine, is the story I just told you a few minutes ago. But interestingly, most of the people there were looking at that relationship the other way around. They were looking at it as hunger or food insecurity being the driver of political instability. And certainly the Arab Spring was one of the things they were looking at, but they were also looking at much longer term things to do with productive resources, with marine resources, with plant. What would happen to the ownership of patents on seeds and all this kind of. So it was a very wide-ranging discussion. But the storyline that came out of that was that actually, at least from a sort of a U.S. policy perspective, they were much more worried about hunger driving political instability than they were about political instability or conflict driving famine. And to be sure, I think it's worth saying here someplace, the number of people in the world that are at risk of actual famines is not that high. There was. I mean, we're talking about maybe 15 million people in Yemen at the moment that are at risk, but that number is much higher than the number in Somalia in 2011, which was about 1 million that were actually at risk of famine, and even smaller numbers in Nigeria, and in South Sudan, I believe the latest numbers are something like 6 million. Now, none of those people are or very few, maybe in the hundreds of thousands, are actually in famine or famine-like conditions at the moment. But there are probably 25 or 30 million people globally that are at risk of famine. There are lots and lots more that are at risk of, a food insecurity crisis of a lesser severity. So not, malnutrition not that high, or the crude death rate not that high, but nevertheless still crisis that requires humanitarian assistance of some kind to help keep people alive, and which requires addressing not only the sort of immediate human needs, but also the underlying causes of whatever it is that's causing the crisis. So yes, to answer your question, hunger can be a cause certainly of political instability, and political instability, at least in a couple of cases that we've seen recently, can lead to war. But again, it's not like there's a single factor that drives a single outcome. These, all these things have multiple.
Well,
and there were cases in the Arab Spring where conflict was managed reasonably well, and some reforms resulted from it, and there was no either mass food insecurity problem or major political instability.
wait a minute, I lost. What case
Tunisia.
are we talking about now?
Well, probably Tunisia would be the closest case
Tunisia?
to that example. Yes, which is actually where the Arab Spring phenomenon began.
And you say it was handled well?
Well, I mean, there were certainly some hiccups along the way, but in Tunisia there was political reform. Some of the underlying issues were addressed. There was a more democratic form of governance that was introduced, etc., and there was not either a major hunger crisis or a major civil war resulting. But there was a civil war in Libya. There was one in Syria. To some degree, you can trace the Yemen crisis back to those roots. And in Egypt, there wasn't a war, but there was a pretty repressive government that resulted from all those experiences. So the answer to your question is a qualified yes. Hunger can be a cause of conflict.
Yes, I'm thinking about cases where I believe, for example, Yemen now, where the famine is predominantly caused on purpose by the Saudis and other Yemeni groups to starve as part of the population into submission. And in that case, I keep wondering what can be done or what should be done to alleviate the situation. Could people, in a case of that kind, could NGOs, for example, take, let's say, drones and use them to just violate the terms of the blockade and just send in food to wherever they want it to go in order to save these people? What is the political response to that? Are people actually, are countries and humanitarian organizations feeling obliged to observe the blockade that a country is illegally imposing on people? Or are there any efforts to simply send the food in and take the consequences?
First of all, there are lots of efforts going on to try and ensure humanitarian access in Yemen. I mean, to answer your direct question, I don't think it's feasible to feed or to provide adequate food assistance for 15 million people by drones that would by definition be having to come from outside the country. I mean, the big issue is keeping the ports open, keeping throughput going through the ports rapidly enough, and then ensuring access on the ground to the populations that actually need the assistance. The situation in Yemen is weird because, on the one hand, the Saudis and the Emiratis being the main belligerent actors in the war, with the support of the U.S. and the U.K. and France, etc. On the other hand, the two biggest donors to the humanitarian effort are the Saudis and the Emiratis. On the one hand, they're trying to quash the insurgency of the Houthis, and they're doing so by pretty brutal military means. At the same time, they're funding the biggest chunk of the UN humanitarian response. So that makes it very difficult for the humanitarian response to be independent or to be as free to do what it feels like it should do. And the obvious solution is to try to bring some kind of a political settlement in the conflict. And in fact, there are people who think maybe that's the direction that things are moving now. I'm not adequately up to date on all the details of the peace talks and so forth, but our understanding is that there are efforts underway now to try and negotiate not only the ceasefire around the port of Hodeidah, which has been in place since early December, but maybe a broader settlement to the conflict and some modus vivendi for the Saudis and the Houthis to get along, which has been the sticking point all along. But to your sort of broader point about do humanitarians sort of respect the rules of the game, and by the rules of the game, I presume you mean national sovereignty, etc.
Yeah.
This has been a
power politics. I mean, if a country's going to shoot you down if you come near with a basket full of food, well, some people would simply not come near with a basket full of food. So,
yeah, that's a bit of an exaggeration to characterize it like that. It's what's more likely happening is that access is being restricted on the ground either by conflict itself or by bureaucratic obstacles being thrown up for one reason or another, and food not reaching the places, or even humanitarian assessment teams not reaching the places where we have reason to think that the situation is the underlying argument here is about how do humanitarian agencies respond when a state or a government is a belligerent in a conflict that involves their own people, and the ability of humanitarian actors to access people and help protect their lives or lives extremely limited. There is a whole school of thought in humanitarianism that rejects the notion of sovereignty. I mean, it's the Without Borders or Sans Frontières movement, Médecins Sans Frontières being the sort of originators of this idea, but there are a number of other agencies that operate on a similar principle, and that is that human life is more valuable than national sovereignty, and so we're willing to violate national sovereignty if need be to protect human life and human dignity. Mm-hmm. There are a lot of humanitarian agencies that don't go that far, and of course, if you do go that far, you run the risk of being expelled from the country and not being able to access people at all. But there certainly is a school of thought that rejects the notion that national sovereignty trumps human rights or humanitarian access. Mm-hmm. And it's always a trade-off, because if you go too far down that road and you're expelled from a country, the expulsion may make headlines and draw attention to a problem, but then you completely cut yourself off from any kind of access to that population. Mm-hmm. And drones aren't going to solve the problem in the short term. And of course, there's an irony about using drones to address the problems of a war that drones are actually administering in the first place. I think people would have a real fear of anything coming by drone in Yemen.
I see. Oh yeah. Of course, I hadn't thought about that, but that makes sense. Yeah. And of course, even if whether or not the government forbids the humanitarian aid, other people may make it impossible. I think not often, but sometimes MSF has actually had to leave a country because people were being killed. I don't know whether that sort of thing has happened to people who are trying to simply deliver food and medical supplies, or not. Has that ever been the case?
Yes, that's increasingly the case. Yeah, I mean, there are certainly a lot more cases of murder or kidnap or other forms of violence against aid workers now than there was 10 or 15 or 20 years ago. There's also a lot more aid workers out there now than there were 10 or 15 or 20 years ago. So the people that track this stuff say, if you just track the number of incidents, they are increasing at a fairly alarming rate. If you look at the number of incidents per 1,000 aid workers, let's say, those kind of incidents are going up, but not as rapidly, because there are a lot more aid workers out there. And unfortunately, most of them are citizens of the countries that are in the crisis. I mean, the risk to national staff of humanitarian agencies is much, much greater than the risk to international staff, simply because national staff go places that international staff are not allowed to go. Mm-hmm. Or in the case of South Sudan, where you have a war of one group against another group, being from the wrong group and the wrong place is often putting you at great risk as well. So,
well, how risky would you say the whole occupation is? If I wanted to become an aid worker, would you give me any caution and say, this is a pretty dangerous occupation in general?
Statistically, it is. Yeah, I don't think it's as dangerous as some occupations, but it's certainly. We're always concerned, particularly in conflict situations, but even sometimes in natural disasters, quite concerned about people's safety and security. But equally, well, maybe not equally, but certainly of additional concern is, what happens to people in other ways. Psychologically, people get traumatized. You see a lot of people not taking very good care of themselves. You see alcohol abuse or drug abuse or dangerous sexual practices. All these kinds of things are, I wouldn't say rampant, but they're certainly characteristic of people working in some of these big emergencies, just because it's such a traumatic environment. You're often living under difficult circumstances. You're in danger a lot of the time, etc. So I caution, obviously I teach people who are in the business or wanting to get into this sort of profession. And, my colleagues and I do caution students a lot about, how they take care of themselves, both in terms of keeping safe in conflict situations, but also how they take care of themselves, psychologically and physically when you're working under pretty difficult circumstances and, pretty constantly difficult circumstances.
Okay, I hadn't even thought about
even in big natural disasters, people can get pretty traumatized.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, obviously not as traumatized maybe as the affected populations by the disaster, but when you're dealing with those populations day in and day out, it can be quite traumatic for aid workers as well.
Okay,
and in part, people think, well, I shouldn't consider how this is affecting me because it's affecting everybody else so much worse. But it's, on the other hand, you can't really help anybody else if you yourself are traumatized or you yourself are behaving, kind of irresponsibly.
Okay, well, I can see that could be a situation. Tell me about South Sudan, because I don't really understand what has happened there. Have you been have you been going there? And
all throughout this crisis and before, we've been working in South Sudan. Well, actually, I guess me personally, since the early 2000s, but through the Feinstein Center since about 2006, 2007. How you interpret what's happening in South Sudan kind of depends on what you take as the baseline or as sort of the original sin. There was a 30-year-long, or depending on how you count, maybe 50-year-long war of liberation against the North. I mean, it literally started with independence from the sort of Anglo-Egyptian colonial setup in the 1950s. Southerners were fighting for independence or at least autonomy within a Sudanese state, and there was a peace accord that put an end to that war in 1972, and was successful for 9 years, but increased political pressure in the north to Islamize the whole country and introduce Sharia law in the whole country, along with an attempt to, if you will, straighten out the Nile. The Nile flows through something called the Sud, which is a huge swamp. And of course, northern Sudan and Egypt both depend heavily on the waters from the Nile. So there was a
say that
massive,
word again. Excuse me. It flows through.
It's called the Sud, which is a huge swamp. S-U-D-D, yes, S-U-D-D. It's a huge swamp in central southern Sudan, through which the Nile flows. And the backup from the swamp causes much of South Sudan to flood during the rainy season. So there was this huge engineering project in the 1970s to straighten out the Nile. It was called the Jonglei Canal, and it was going to dig a canal that went along the eastern side of the Nile and bypassed the Sud. That would have created a much more rapid flow of water to northern Sudan and Egypt than the Nile passing through the Sud did. But it would have dried up the Sud, and it would have destroyed much of the economy of southern Sudan. So the combination of the introduction of Sharia law and the attempt, and that canal was fairly far along. It wasn't finished, but it was getting close. Led to another rebellion in the south in 1983, which eventually became the SPLA war. That eventually came to a sort of a military stalemate that resulted in a peace deal in 2005. But if you want to look at what happened in South Sudan, there were two different sort of wings to the SPLA that had an internal falling out in the early 1990s. And from some people's point of view, some of the attacks and the massacres that took place at that point were the original sin in South Sudanese history that the victims of that massacre have never forgiven them for. The other side of the story is that there was a massacre in the army barracks in Juba in December of 2013 that started the current war. And there's no getting around the fact that it was mostly Nuer troops attacking a mostly Dinka town in 1991, and most of the victims of that massacre were Dinka. So if you look at the war from the sort of SPLA or Dinka point of view, the current SPLA, which is dominated now by the Dinka, you would see that Boer massacre of 1991 as the original sin. If you look at it from the other point of view, you look at the massacre of Nuer troops in Juba in 2013 as the original sin, and that everything that's followed on from that is at the hands of the group that committed those massacres. What happened in 2000?
Sorry, let me clarify one thing. I had heard it had to do with Islam versus Christianity, that there's a cleavage between
not in South Sudan. No, not in South Sudan. No? That was an element in the Sudanese civil war between the South and the North.
Okay.
The North is Arabic and almost 100% Islamic. The South was of Bantu or Nilotic origin. In other words, you can call them Africans. And it was a somewhat Christianized context mostly, but mostly practitioners of traditional religion in the South. So there was an element. I mean, it wasn't really Christianity versus Islam in the SPLA war. It was South versus North, but the North was predominantly Islamic, and to the extent that Southerners had embraced any sort of global religion, they were Christians. But it wasn't a religious war per se, and there's no element of religion in the current war.
How did this political or military confrontation translate into famine?
Well, it didn't immediately. The followers of the vice president left Juba under difficult circumstances and regrouped in their home territory. And because they had defected in mass, there was effectively an army in waiting there to be commanded. And there was, so a war broke out between the SPLA, which was the government, and the SPLA in opposition, which was the group that was loyal to the vice president. Right away, there were attacks on civilians in Greater Upper Nile as well as in Juba, and a lot of people were displaced. And of course, displacement is one of the causes of initially not famine. Initially, it was just a fear of people getting access to adequate food for sort of normal survival. And there was a huge humanitarian operation that was launched almost immediately. But the pockets of famine broke out in places where there was repeated battles between these two groups, and with civilian populations caught in between, being repeatedly displaced, repeatedly unable to plant or harvest. Their livestock were looted or killed, etc. So the war started really in late December of 2013 or early 2014, and it was 3 years later before we were actually declaring a famine in South Sudan. So these things took a while to play out. Mm-hmm. But and there were several different instances. There were instances in Jonglei the actual famine was declared in unity state, there were cases in Western Moral Ghazal and other places where there were close to famine or famine conditions prevailing, and it was there largely as a result of not only people being displaced, but people being displaced and then blocked from access to towns or access to markets, etc. Mm-hmm. So there isn't so much of a storyline of drought or climatic causes of the crisis in South Sudan. There are some market drivers, but those are largely the result of trade routes being blocked or trade being disrupted by conflict. In other words, you can trace most of what's happened in South Sudan back to the conflict.
Were there any cases in which the food was deliberately blockaded and people were not allowed to transport food?
Yes. I mean, humanitarian access was quite difficult for a long period of time in Central Unity. There were attempts to get food through, but often people were displaced from the places where they could actually get food, and they weren't able to get access to those places. Whether that was a deliberate act of war or it was a consequence of war is hard to say, because if you want to argue deliberate action, you have to know what someone's motivations are. It's kind of hard to see what those are. Mm-hmm. It was perhaps a little clearer in the case of Greater Bagari and Western Maral Ghazal. Their population were blocked from accessing markets, from accessing towns, and humanitarian actors were blocked from accessing the displaced people for a period of time. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think I understand you've already interviewed Alex Duvall. He has a kind of a hierarchy of what he would call famine crimes, and deliberately blocking people's access to food, whether through markets or through humanitarian sources, would be what he would call, sort of first-degree famine crime. He would call policies that you're pursuing, even though you know that they might lead to people not being able to access food, he would call like a second-degree famine crime. And I think there's a pretty strong argument that you could make that we've seen cases of that we saw cases of it in Somalia. We've probably seen cases of it in Nigeria and Yemen, but certainly in South Sudan as well. Mm-hmm.
But I would take that assume that the Yemen case, the recent Yemen case, would be the most extreme version. That this is an absolutely military action, keeping a port from being accessible.
Well, the port isn't entirely inaccessible. There are a number of maritime inspection routines that have to go on to ensure that weapons aren't coming in with shipments of food. And then there have been attacks on the port itself. So there's insecurity in the port, and then there's a whole series of bureaucratic constraints getting food out of the port, especially if it has to cross front lines in the battle. So it's not a case that the port has ever actually been absolutely inaccessible, but there's been a number of constraints that have slowed down the throughput of food. But that's only a partial explanation for what's happening in Yemen. I mean, there have been the collapse of the economy, which has meant that the value of the currency has collapsed. So people, even if they have money, their purchasing power has been severely reduced. There was a large cohort of people that were dependent on civil servant wages, and those wages haven't been paid for years. So even if there's food available in the market, people can't afford it. At least in late 2018, there was a severe liquidity crisis in the economy, so that traders couldn't get money to buy food to import. Even if there was some throughput going through the port, traders couldn't get letters of credit to buy food, etc. So there was a whole bunch of drivers of, the war is kind of at the root of all these, but it plays out in different ways. It's not just out and out attacks on civilians, which have happened. It's not just out and out attacks on civilian livelihoods, which have happened. But it's kind of a combination of all these things.
Mm-hmm. Okay, now, I know that there is a campaign, if I'm not using too strong a term for it, at least an effort to get some sort of declaration through the United Nations that that famine is an act of war, or that it's a violation of human rights, or something of that kind. I've heard that kind of argument. I think Rhoda Howard Hassman and Alex Duvall and Hillel Elver have made similar arguments, if I'm not mistaken in putting them in the same category. Tell me about that campaign, if it's fair to call it a campaign.
Well, there is a Security Council resolution linking conflict and hunger. I'm not sure if the word famine was actually used in the UN Security Council Resolution 2417, which was passed in 2018 at some point, has been kind of the rallying point around this. I think there are people who would like to go further, Alex among them, who would actually like to see cases of famine crimes brought to the International Criminal Court, and people charged with crimes against humanity based on their actions in warfare to limit or deprive people's access to food. That's not exactly the area that I work in, and it wouldn't necessarily be the tack that I would take. I mean, I think if you're trying to work in a humanitarian context, you're often worried about negotiating access. Mm-hmm. And to do that, you have to be talking to the bad guys. I mean, you can't get access to people that are being blocked in a conflict if you're not negotiating with the people who are blocking them. Mm-hmm. So to be doing that on the one hand, and to be openly advocating for them to be brought before a court of law, yeah, doesn't get you to first base in terms of the access negotiations. So I mean, in some ways, those are kind of parallel but different approaches to the issue of famine. And then, of course, there is the whole track about, well, let's try to address the underlying causes of the conflict in the first place, and bring about some kind of a negotiated peace settlement. In which case, the hope would be that the use of food as a means of war would no longer be necessary. My understanding from talking to the lawyers, and again, I am not a lawyer, so I can't speak with much authority on this, but the existing laws that we have, international humanitarian law, about the use of starvation as a method of war are such that it's pretty difficult to make a case, because you have to be able to show intent, and you have to be able to show that this particular set of actions led to this particular set of outcomes, meaning a famine or people starving to death. And while you can certainly make the argument that this is one of the causal factors, to say that this is the thing that caused this is a little bit difficult to do as well. Mm-hmm. I don't think that's a good reason to not go ahead and pursue this agenda, but I think it's probably more of a kind of naming and shaming agenda than it is actually bringing cases to trial.
Mm-hmm. Well, I
don't know whether Alex would agree with me on that or not, but I think certainly trying to highlight the issue, and to bring to the attention of policymakers in states, or even in armed groups, for that matter, non-state armed groups, that they might be guilty of war crimes by using by blocking access to food, or blocking humanitarian access to severely food insecure people. That might have a deterrent effect. We've seen examples where that where we've been led to believe that may be the case.
Uh-huh. I think shame is a very powerful human motive, and should be used appropriately. Because, I mean, for example, now the effort to bring the nuclear weapons states into compliance with the ban treaty, the new treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons. I think the only mechanism that is really has any potential of being effective is shaming them, and I'm all in favor of using it. So I guess in principle, it might be a good thing to keep in the armament of of humanitarian workers as well, trying to save people by pointing a finger at the bad guys sometimes.
And many of the people that are in, this campaign or sort of have advocacy as their advocacy or legal means as their major method wouldn't necessarily call themselves humanitarians. I don't think. I mean, they would be activists, or they'd be human rights activists or other things. The humanitarians are always trying to do something on the ground to protect people's lives in the short term. But I think a lot of the advocacy groups wouldn't necessarily say that that's their primary concern. But so I mean, I think there's multiple different ways that we have to address this problem.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. Thank you very much too.
Okay. Bye.
This conversation is one of the weekly series Talk About Saving the World, produced by Peace Magazine and Project Save the World. Please visit our website at tosavetheworld.ca, where you can sign the Platform for Survival, a list of 25 public policy proposals that, if enacted, would greatly reduce the risk of 6 global threats to humankind. Come back next week for another discussion of a serious global issue.